Last night, the neighbors heard a scream from the silent wooden house at the end of Willow Creek Road, and when the lights flickered on, they saw the shadow of an old man, holding something in his arms, trembling as if the world had shattered. Tell us where you're watching from, we'd truly love to know, and if there was a moment in this story that touched your soul, please share it with us in the comments. It would mean the world to us to hear your heart. The house belonged to Henry, 71, and his wife Margaret, 73. They had lived there for more than 4 decades, and though the walls were filled with photographs, the absence of children was a silent weight in every frame. They had only one companion, a golden retriever named Daisy, who was more than a pet. She was their child, their joy, their laughter. Their mornings began with the slow rhythm of coffee and the sound of Daisy's paws tapping on the wooden floor. Henry often sat by the window watching the road that rarely saw visitors, while Margaret hummed old hymns pretending not to feel the ache of loneliness. They never spoke much about the emptiness of not having children, but sometimes, in the quiet evenings, Margaret would whisper, "If Daisy had not come to us, I think the silence would have killed me." Henry would simply squeeze her hand tighter. One autumn evening, a storm rolled in, the kind of storm that shakes windows and reminds old bones of the years gone by. The couple sat by the fireplace, Daisy curled between them. But in the middle of the night, Daisy whimpered louder than ever before. It was not her usual call for attention. It was sharp, broken, filled with a strange fear. Margaret woke first, her heart pounding. Henry turned on the lamp and saw Daisy standing stiff, staring at the front door. Her golden fur bristled as if something unseen had entered the house. Henry tried to calm her down, but the dog growled low and steady, a sound she had never made in her life. The old man walked carefully to the door, opened it, and found nothing but rain and wind, yet the dog would not stop growling. Margaret clutched her shawl and whispered, "Henry, something is wrong." They shut the door, yet the feeling of being watched remained. The storm lasted all night, and by morning, Daisy had changed. She was quiet, restless. She refused to eat. She kept sitting near the door, staring, as if someone was still out there. Margaret feared she might be sick. Henry thought perhaps it was just age catching up. But that night, when Henry went to fetch more firewood, he swore he saw footprints in the mud leading to the back of the house, barefoot, human-like, prints too large to belong to either of them. He followed them a few steps, but they vanished near the shed. When he returned, Daisy barked in panic. Margaret, pale and trembling, asked what he had seen. Henry lied and said nothing, only wet ground. He did not want her fear to grow, but as the fire crackled that night, Daisy lay with her head heavy on Margaret's lap, her breathing slower, her eyes glassy. The couple exchanged a look filled with dread for the first time in years. Henry felt powerless, as if the walls of the silent house were closing in. The scream the neighbors would later hear had not yet happened, but the seed of terror was already growing inside that lonely home, and it was only the beginning of what they could not escape. The morning after the storm, Henry woke to silence so heavy it felt like the walls were listening. Daisy had not moved all night, and her breathing had turned shallow. Margaret refused to leave her side, stroking her fur, whispering prayers. Henry made tea, but his hands shook, spilling drops on the floor. He tried to convince himself that Daisy was only tired, but the look in her eyes told another story of something unseen that had crossed into their lives by afternoon. Daisy suddenly stood and walked to the back door. She pressed her nose against the wood, then let out a single long howl, so deep that it seemed to carry through the empty valley. Margaret gasped. Henry hurried to her side, but before he could open the door, Daisy collapsed. Her body trembled as if she had been struck by something invisible. Henry lifted her in his arms and cried out for Margaret to bring a blanket. They wrapped Daisy and laid her by the fire, hoping warmth would save her, but nothing changed. That night Henry could not sleep. He kept hearing faint footsteps outside, on the gravel, slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling the house. He gripped the old rifle that had hung above the mantel for years unused. Margaret whispered she could hear it too, and begged him not to go out. so he sat in the chair, staring at the door until dawn. When the first light broke, he went outside and found the footprints again, this time clear, larger, and leading straight to the shed. The lock was broken. He pushed the door and it creaked open. Inside, the air was cold and damp though the sun was rising. There was nothing unusual except for an old rocking chair that had belonged to his mother, rocking gently on its own. Henry froze. The chair had been in the attic for years. How did it get here? He felt his chest tighten, but forced himself to drag the chair out and lock the shed again. When he returned, Margaret was crying. Daisy had not moved, and her body felt colder. Henry sat beside her, and for the first time in his life admitted aloud, "Margaret, maybe she is leaving us." Margaret shook her head, holding Daisy close, whispering, "She is all we have. You cannot say that." Suddenly, Daisy's eyes snapped open wide, and, terrified, she tried to stand, but her legs gave way. She whimpered toward the door, again scratching the wood. Her nails screeched against it. Margaret screamed. Henry opened the door in panic, and at that exact moment, the wind blasted in though the air outside was still calm. Daisy tried to crawl out, but collapsed on the porch. She stared into the trees as if something was standing there unseen. Henry followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing, begging Daisy to stay. Henry carried the dog back inside, shutting the door tight. He could feel the house trembling, though there was no storm. Outside, the birds had gone silent. The valley was too still. Henry sat Daisy on the rug, his tears falling on her fur. The old couple clung to each other, listening to the ticking of the clock. Each tick felt louder, like a countdown. They both knew something was approaching, though they could not name it. As night fell, the silence grew unbearable. Then, from the upstairs hallway, door slammed shut even though every window was locked, and no one had been up there for years. Henry and Margaret looked at each other in terror. They were no longer alone in their silent house. Henry gathered his courage and climbed the stairs, each creak of the wood sounding like a cry in the dark. Margaret followed, gripping his sleeve, whispering prayers as if words could protect them. They reached the hallway where the door had slammed. The old bedroom, where once they had stored forgotten trunks, now stood wide open. The curtains moved though the windows were sealed. Henry stepped inside. The room smelled of damp earth as if the ground itself had been disturbed. In the corner sat the rocking chair, again swaying gently on its own. Henry stared, frozen. Margaret clutched his arm. Daisy, weak and trembling, dragged herself to the bottom of the stairs, whimpering as if warning them away. Suddenly, the light bulb overhead flickered and burst, showering glass on the floor, plunging the room into darkness. Margaret screamed. Henry pulled her back, and they stumbled down the stairs. Daisy barked a desperate sound, but then collapsed again. Henry lifted her trembling body. His heart breaking, he whispered, "Stay with us, please. Do not leave us now." Margaret wept, saying, "She is our child. She cannot go yet." Daisy's eyes stared past them toward the window, as if something unseen was standing outside, watching. Henry turned, and for a split second he swore he saw a pale figure in the reflection, tall, motionless, with eyes like empty hollows. He blinked, and it was gone. That night, the silence in the house grew unbearable. Every clock stopped at midnight. The couple sat by the fireplace, with Daisy between them, praying. For morning hours passed. The fire dimmed, the walls groaned. Then came a knock at the front door, slow, deliberate, 3 times. Henry raised the rifle. Margaret shook her head, begging him not to answer, but Daisy lifted her head weakly and barked once more. Her final bark. Henry's hands shook as he opened the door, expecting emptiness. But what he saw froze his soul. A trail of muddy footprints led inside the house across the floor. Though no one stood at the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. Margaret screamed, holding Daisy. The air grew icy. The photographs on the walls fell one by one, shattering glass, echoing through the house. Henry shouted, "Leave us alone," but the silence answered back, pressing heavier on their chests. Daisy let out a final sigh, and her body went still. Margaret collapsed, holding her, crying like a mother. Henry fell to his knees, feeling his world collapse around him. At that moment, the rocking chair upstairs began to creak louder, faster, as if someone unseen was laughing. The couple clung to each other, surrounded by shadows. In the morning, the neighbors came after hearing cries again. They found the front door wide open, the fireplace cold, Daisy lying peacefully as if asleep. Henry and Margaret sat together on the rug, holding her between eyes closed, their faces calm as if they had followed her into silence. The neighbors whispered that perhaps love had bound the three souls too tightly to ever part. The silent house still stands at the end of Willow Creek Road, and on stormy nights, locals say they hear the bark of a golden retriever followed by the soft humming of an old woman and the steady voice of a man comforting her. Though no one lives there anymore, the house is never truly empty, for love, once planted, refuses to die, and sometimes it lingers in ways we cannot explain.